Thank you everyone for coming. I'm J.W. Walker, one of the organizers for the Queer Liberation March. Happy Pride, everyone. We're here today to ensure that the marchers in the Queer Liberation March this year do not have to go through the violence by the NYPD that we went through last year. Over the course of the last year, since last June, the NYPD has continually attacked queer and trans-led protests in this city, injuring our community members for no reason, for the ridiculousness of breaking curfew, for somebody writing 3-inch high letters on the back of a police car, for just being Black and brown and trans and marching for Black lives. We have seen this time and time again over the last year and over the last many decades. The fact that it took the NYPD 50 years to apologize for Stonewall is indicative of what little regard the NYPD gives to the violence that they continually perpetrate against members of the LGBTQIA2S communities, particularly the Black and brown and trans members of our communities. Last year, Pride Month started, and within a day, the NYPD was attacking a protest back on June 2nd. We have someone who survived that attack, Jason Rosenberg, who will speak to you in just a moment. Our Queer Liberation March was attacked at the end of the march, resulting in scores of our marchers being injured. And finally, over the course of the last year, the weekly Stonewall Protests, which are held to honor Black lives and specifically Black and brown trans lives, have been set upon by NYPD, specifically the Strategic Response Group, on more occasions than I can actually count. So right now I'm going to call up Jason Rosenberg to speak a little to his experience last June 2nd. Jason?
Hi, my name is Jason Rosenberg. I use he, him pronouns, and I'm an ACT UP New York member and an organizer of the Queer Liberation March. It's a little hard to believe that I am a day short of a year ago attack against queer and trans protesters last year on June 2nd, 2020. We commemorated here last year to remember and honor the Black and brown, trans and queer people that we lost due to state violence and due to hate violence. Throughout our march that day, we were faced with continual surveillance and abuse by the NYPD. There's been a lot of healing since that year, but there's a lot of healing that I'm still working on. Sometimes the most difficult thing to remember is the idea of not even remembering what happened sometimes. I woke up from a concussion to a pool of blood on 14th and 5th Street and 5th Avenue, my glasses and mask on the floor, and gradual, unimaginable pain from a broken arm, 11 staples to the head, and numerous gashes and bruises. What I do remember is asking my arrested officer why this happened to me and several others at that protest. He cited Mayor de Blasio's curfew. What I do remember is my fellow comrades who were among the 100 other arrestees that day demanding and chanting a medic get to my attention. I was denied medical attention for 3 hours and I was released and eventually went to the ER. Although I can't remember which officers did this to me, the culprit was never a few or one or several other officers. It was always the system of policing in this country and the system of policing in this city. A system that allows state-sanctioned violence to prevail without any repercussions. A system that targets, surveils, and abuses our black and brown siblings, our sex work community, our other vulnerable communities that face continual violence during Pride Month and beyond Pride Month. Sometimes I'm asked what justice would look like if it were up to me. Justice for me is justice for Tony McDade. Justice for me is justice for Kowalski Trawick, a black 32-year-old man who was killed by the NYPD in April 2019. Someone who suffered immense mental health stress and was killed by 2 police officers as a result. The officers are still working today with no disciplinary action and are not charged for the death of Kowalski Trawick. Justice for me is justice for Kiwi Herring, a black trans woman who was killed by the STL police. And justice for me is seeing a world without the police. The only safety is community, and we wish for a pride without the police. We have been creating a space and honoring a space that does not involve the police for now our 3rd year. And we wish to see a world without the police and safety for our queer and trans siblings. Thank you.
Thank you, Jason. So that happened, what happened to Jason Rosenberg happened on June 2nd. About 3.5 weeks later, we held the Queer Liberation March for Black Lives and against police brutality. We marched without barricades. We marched without a large police contingent policing our march because we had marshals to keep our community safe as they marched up from Foley Square here to Stonewall and then over to Washington Square Park. That march was set upon at the very end, and I'd like to call up one of our rear marshals who was present when the police set upon the end of our march and Northrop.
Good morning. I'm Ann Northrop, an organizer of the Queer Liberation March, and I was a marshal at last year's Queer Liberation March as it entered Washington Square Park. When I came upon the end of the march there, what I saw were NYPD officers beating members of our march, peaceful marchers, with batons, spraying them with pepper spray, and of course the classic image of a cop pushing someone on a bicycle over into the street. Just random, unnecessary violence for no reason at all. The NYPD has a long history of violence and brutality, and as you've just heard, killing members of our communities and all communities. We are sick of it. People say, well, they apologize for Stonewall. What's your problem? Well, what about the last 50 years? What about the hundreds of years before that? What about what they did last year? They have not apologized, they have not explained, they have not punished any of their officers, and they've done nothing to reform themselves. We hear a lot about police reform or defund the police, and there's a lot of rhetoric out there, but when it comes to really holding people accountable, we see nothing from our government officials or politicians. They are not holding the NYPD accountable. And we want the NYPD held accountable for their violence and brutality. It is astonishing to me that in a year last year and since, when all this talk about brutality has happened, the police response is more brutality. We cannot live in a world like that. We want peace, we want progress, and we are angry at the NYPD. Thank you.
Thank you, Ann. So that's how we closed out Pride Month, with more violence from the NYPD. As the summer progressed, the summer of the reckoning for racial justice that was spawned by the deaths of George Floyd, Ahmaud Arbery, Breonna Taylor, and so many more black people specifically and brown people attacked by police officers all over this country. Many groups were formed in this city, groups formed to respond to these injustices. One of those groups was Warriors in the Garden. The leader of that group, Warriors of the Garden, was supposed to speak today, Derek Ingram. However, he recently got his COVID vaccine and is suffering from the ill effects that can sometimes happen, so he was unable to make it. However, he did send a short statement that I will read. On August 7th, the New York Police Department, NYPD, brought dozens of officers, a helicopter, drones, sharpshooters, riot police, and police dogs in a 5-hour-long attempt to arrest Derek Ingram as he was going at that time, a prominent organizer of Black Lives Matter actions through the Warriors in the Garden. The one thing they did not bring was a warrant. In a clear attempt to intimidate Black Lives Matter protesters and chill free speech, the NYPD tried to mislead Derek about his rights, threatened to break down his door, attempted to interrogate him without counsel, and stationed dozens of officers in his hallway, on his fire escape, and in tactical positions in and around nearby buildings. The police left only after he live streamed the events. A large crowd of protesters gathered, and the media began asking questions. These tactics are not new and are disproportionately used against queer activists of color across the nation. What we have seen continually is that when queer people of color, when trans people of color try to organize, the NYPD attacks. They are not attacking in response to any actions often. They are often attacking in response to what they perceive as the organizers or the protesters not respecting their authority. They are just being brutal. What we do in the Queer Liberation March and what we have done since we began in 2019 is to demand that our march not have any sort of large contingent of police officers lining our sides with their motor scooters, that they not send tons of armed officers to our start out space or our end space. And I will be honest, at last year's march and the information that we found in the days after the attack by the NYPD, what we realized is that the detail that was assigned to us was actually very respectful for the length of our march. Okay, I will give them credit for that. They were led by an officer who's a long time led the detail for the Dyke March, for the Heritage of Pride parade, etc. Was very respectful, did not overwhelm us with police. They respected our right not to have barricades lining our sides so that people can join in. However, what we found was that hidden away in a corner somewhere near the park, the Strategic Response Group, or SURGE, SRG, which was originally founded to deal with terrorist situations, were hidden away in the areas around Washington Square Park, laying in wait to come after the Queer Liberation March for Black Lives and against police brutality. What we know is that this was not coordinated with the detail assigned to us. This was something that the Strategic Response Group decided to do on their own. The leadership of that group decided to do on their own, and again, for no good reason. We are all out here today to tell the SRG, Commissioner Shea, Mayor de Blasio, and the leadership of the SRG, do not come near the Queer Liberation March this year. You can pretend that you are doing this out of a sense of keeping our march or our rally safe, but we know that you do not keep us safe. You cause violence every time you show up. Your only purpose is to cause violence so that then you can manipulate a message that a protest was violent. We've seen this all over the country, and we have seen it here in New York City. And so we, as the Queer Liberation March, want you to know that we are going to be having our entire march marshaled as we have had every year. We are going to have legal observers from multiple organizations, including the NYCLU, including Legal Aid, including the National Lawyers Guild. We are going to have Cop Watch present. We are going to have marshals in the monitoring all of the areas around our starting point and our end point for the sole purpose of protecting our participants from violence committed by the NYPD. That is what the law enforcement apparatus in New York City has forced us to do. And we will do it because we want to keep our marchers, our participants, our guests, and all New Yorkers safe from this kind of violence. Who keeps us safe?
We keep us safe.
Who keeps us safe?
We keep us safe.
Who keeps us safe?
We keep us safe.
Not the NYPD. Thank you. If anyone else would like to come up to the podium to speak, otherwise, if there are any questions, we're happy to take them. Jason, talking about what happened to you.
What's up?
I just want to know what exactly happened to you.
Yeah. So we had in June 2nd, there was a march created by the Queer Detainee Project. It was held here at Stonewall. It was actually pushed back because of Mayor de Blasio's curfew. I think that was the second or third day of that curfew. We then continued to march up and down Manhattan or across the village, and there were arrests that happened along the West Side Highway. We continued past curfew, and that's when the NYPD increased and escalated riot police, as Jay mentioned, SRGs, and we had an overwhelming amount of police violence that happened as a result. And, you know, we have to be intentional about what that march was. That was a march specific to Black and brown, queer and trans lives on June 2nd, the second day after Pride Month. And what happened to me was that we created a blockade to prevent police violence from happening and from escalating within our space of protest. There were hundreds of officers that came our way and broke our nonviolent blockade. And as a result, I was forced to the ground, I was hit in all sides, and I had a broken humerus. I had 2 spots on my head that were gashed, 11 staples to the head, and otherwise just emotional pain. So that is what I'm dealing with. I know I'm not alone in this. This is trauma, and historical trauma that has happened for decades and still happens. So when we talk about this dialogue of banning cops and Pride, this is not only about the work that Reclaim Pride has done for over 3 years. This is about keeping our community safe, as Jay mentioned. Thanks.
Yes. It was recently announced that at the NYPD's insistence, a curfew for Washington Square Park has been announced by the mayor's office and the NYPD. The ostensible reason for this is that large events have been happening in the park and violence has occurred. Those were the statements that were given out by NYPD. What the NYPD didn't include in their statements is that the violence that occurred was violence committed by NYPD officers against just people enjoying their evenings in Washington Square Park. This year, like last year, the Queer Liberation March is again ending in Washington Square Park. And so we want to tell the mayor that A, this curfew is ridiculous, because the way to stop the violence that happened in Washington Square Park is to keep these violent police officers from attacking citizens of New York City. And B, we do not, there's absolutely no reason for that curfew. Just as there was no reason for the curfew last year. It was, yes, there were some people that got crazy. They weren't normally affiliated with the protests last year. People that were, bashing in windows or looting, or, it happened a couple of times early on during the summer of the reckoning. By the time the mayor had called the curfew, it wasn't even happening that much anymore. Curfews don't work. They don't do anything. If someone is going to commit crimes, they're already planning to commit crimes. So what do they care about breaking a curfew? Any other questions? Okay, great. Well, thank you very much.
Thank you. Okay.